Thanks for coming back. It's always tough after a break. But I wanted to take a little bit of time tonight to talk about connectivity. And I think it's really important in a world like the world of today, where everybody's thinking about their phones and their devices, and where technology companies are talking about how they can get connectivity everywhere to the bottom billion people, the mysterious bottom billion consumers. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what that connectivity means and what that access to information means in a world where those 2 billion consumers are going to be the next market. And if I have one point I'd like to make in the next 15 minutes, it's that access to information, while it's a human right, is not enough. If you give people access to information, if you give them that connectivity, if you give them that Wi-Fi and 3G, and you don't give them access to choice, access to opportunity in their own life, you're not making the change necessary to actually advance humanity. And the analogy I'd like to use a little bit in this talk is the analogy of information and water. Everybody in the world has access to water. If you don't have access to water, you die. 783 million people don't have access to clean water. And because of that, in 2014, 2 million children under 5 die of easily preventable waterborne diseases. And so when we think about creating channels of access and methods of access to these basic, fundamental pieces of human existence, things like water and things like information, I'd like to work for the next few minutes with you guys to think about what services we need to create around those fundamental rights to allow every child in the world to realize a full potential and a full future. And I'd like to start with a little story. This is Lucy. I met her 1.5 years ago in Moroto in eastern Uganda. She was digging for gold in the dirt, and I asked her, we stopped the car, I asked her, what are you doing? She said she's making between $4 and $10 a month digging for gold. She had left school 3 years before, and she said this in English, which was somewhat surprising to me. And I said to her, why did you leave school? And she said, because school didn't give me the ability to feed my family, to contribute to my family, but this little bit of money, $4, $10 a month, does. And I said, well, what does gold look like? What does a piece, and these are tiny pieces of gold, little flecks. What does it look like? And she said, it looks like seashells. And there's no ocean anywhere near eastern Uganda. There's no ocean in Karamoja, outside of Moroto. She'd learned enough in school to be able to make this metaphor, to be able to talk about something that was very far away. But we hadn't given her any of the access to options, to opportunity, to make that information meaningful, and to keep her from living in a way that prevents dignity and prevents really a full sense of freedom. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we look at what our collective mission is as members of this human planet. UNICEF is in 135 countries. Our mandate is to make sure that the rights of the most vulnerable children, the most marginalized children, are always upheld. And our team, the Innovation Unit in UNICEF, tries to bring the smartest people together in some very rough and difficult to operate in environments and create solutions locally that can affect millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of people. So this is a map I showed a few years ago, and it's still relatively true. This is electricity availability in Africa, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. This is mobile phone coverage. That's interesting. Cell phone coverage, connectivity, the ability to access markets that you're not physically in is so important that mobile phone companies have understood that market and are building towers and keeping cell towers powered, even though it costs them 70% of their operating expenses in many markets to do so. That's how much profit there is when you're talking about connectivity and information. And the analogy to water doesn't end there. A lot of the behaviors that people use when they go to seek out information are similar to behaviors that you use when you seek out water. In Burundi, in a country where 4% of people have access to the electrical grid, and people spend 20% of their daily income keeping their phone, their Nokia 1100, their basic phone, charged, you see the same behaviors as when you go to collect water. In Burundi, people will collect a bunch of phones in a bucket. They'll send it down to a place that has good connectivity. Somebody will charge it. They'll come back up and people will pay for it. In Burundi, people know where the signal is. Even if it's not in their village, they'll know what hill it's on. It's like in my flat in New York, I know I have a very bad mobile carrier. I know which window I can hold my phone up if I want to talk to somebody. And these are the same types of behaviors that we see when people seek any important, critical type of service. And just to give you an example of what that type of service might be and what connectivity can do, I want to talk a little bit about emergencies for a second. And in an emergency, you have children who are separated from their families, who are removed from their caregivers, and these are unaccompanied children. And one of the most important things to do in an emergency is to reconnect that child with its family. The longer a child is apart from its family, the more likely they are to succumb to disease, to suffer psychosocial problems, to be trafficked. In fact, the first airplanes that come into emergencies after disasters, after natural disasters, are often human trafficking planes. And they get there far before humanitarian planes. They have one of the most sophisticated networks in the world. And so it's important to reconnect a child with its family, but for the last 30 years, the way of doing that has been on paper, because there hasn't been connectivity. And you collect the child's name and information, and you try to find the parent, and it usually takes about 6 weeks because you're dealing with carbon paper, which is marvelous technology for 1940, but not for 2014. Probably not even for 1994. But what we were able to do was, working with that connectivity, that base layer of information, create a set of services on top of it, create an application where our aid workers, our frontline workers in an emergency can register a kid. These are the same people who are collecting the information on paper. So it's not just anybody, but it's specific people whose job is to reunite kids with their families, can capture the information, can collect all the vital information about the kid, and can reunite them with their family. And suddenly you reduce the amount of time from 6 weeks to a matter of hours. And that's what happens when you take something like connectivity and you build a layer on top of it. That's a service that people need. This is Tacloban. This is Philippines after the typhoon. You can see infrastructure's been destroyed. We took a team from our innovation lab in Uganda and our innovation lab in South Sudan, the places where this software had been built. It wasn't built in New York. Everything we build in New York fails. We have a 100% failure rate. This was built in innovation labs in countries that actually have this set of problems. And we took that knowledge, we took it to the Philippines, knowing that the infrastructure was so broken, knowing that we had to get that amount of paper into that phone, knowing that there was no electricity in Tacloban for weeks, actually for months afterwards, and knowing that we could work with local problem solvers to create a set of benefits on top of that lack. These are a bunch of car mechanics who were looking at the schematics designed by New York University students for charging phones off of motorcycle batteries and replicating that same hardware in the Philippines. They allowed the aid workers to charge their phones on their motorbikes as they were going out and keep connectivity. And we knew also that if you just bring something into a new environment, if you just drop connectivity, if you drop capacity and you don't localize it, you don't create it there, it doesn't work. These are like 5 of the best nerds in the Philippines. And they actually won an award right before the typhoon for being 5 of the best nerds in the Philippines from the mayor of Tacloban. And what we did was, as soon as our teams came, we found these folks and we said, can you help us customize this application and make it work here? And they did. They made an application built in South Sudan and in Uganda, work in the Philippines, work in the emergency, and not only that, but work afterwards. And the government of the Philippines now has this software, this capacity, in its ongoing day-to-day work as a way to understand and register children, not only in emergencies. And suddenly you see a set of services on top of this connectivity, on top of this information, that actually provides life-saving information. And that's a sort of change. And that makes us ask, what kind of services do you need in an increasingly connected world to make that access to information, to make that connectivity mean something to the world's most vulnerable people? And I just want to give you maybe 3 or 4 examples. I don't know how many I put in here. Let's see. I think they're all good, though. In Zambia right now, a group of young software developers, designers, and project managers has built a system called UReport. They've taken the code of that from a similar system in Uganda, they've customized it, and in Zambia, any kid can get access to counseling services through their phone, through text messaging, and they can ask questions that might be embarrassing to ask a friend or a parent. And they can ask questions about sex and sexually transmitted disease and HIV. And in Zambia, a country with an extremely high HIV burden, the rate of voluntary testing, of how many people will voluntarily go to a clinic to get tested, is about 20%. Use this counseling system for 1 week and actually be able to ask questions and get a response back, and your rate of testing goes up to 43%. That's incredible. But the other incredible thing is that that system was built by Zambian developers, and it was built by a guy who actually wrote artificial intelligence to help track those users and track that information. And he never graduated from college. He learned programming because he was working at an internet cafe outside of Lusaka, and he was bored. Me too. The same system in Uganda has over 260,000 kids who are connected directly to government. UNICEF is able to ask a question, we're able to get a response back in real time, able to take a poll of kids, but it's not just about getting a poll, it's not about just that information, it's about connecting that to actual action. And when we ask those questions, we make sure that there's an information loop that happens, and the information goes back. A member of parliament had a piece of legislation that nobody was applying to. It was an innovation fund, and he asked UNICEF, why is nobody in the country applying to this fund where you can get free money to do innovation, whatever that means. I still don't know what my job title means. But he said, why isn't anybody applying to this fund? And we asked the young UReporters, and we got back answers within minutes. And 40,000 kids, 20% of those responders came back with us within the first day, and they said, we need a high school leaving certificate in order to apply for that fund. And we don't have it, or we lost it, or we never got one. And within 6 weeks, he changed the legislation. That's a real-time legislative change that's happening from people who aren't even voting members of his constituency. I would make a joke about the US government and how ineffective that is at real-time decision-making, but that wouldn't be nice. But check this out. Every birth in Nigeria is reported in real time by text message. Africa's most populous country, 20 million births in the last 2 years. Every one of them comes in by text message. It used to be by paper. Those would come in slowly. We wouldn't know exactly what was happening. Suddenly, the government of Nigeria has a better information management system to know where boys and girls are being born in any given week than most countries in the developed world, whatever that means. And that's incredible. That type of real-time information gives us an ability to create feedback loops that let us and the government give the right sets of services to the right areas and not have to wait a generation to do that. Every mother in Rwanda who's pregnant gets her pregnancy registered and has access to antenatal services if she's having an emergency during childbirth. And we heard about all of the complications that can arise and the need for trained community health workers. If she's having a complication, she can ask a question, which is the clinic to go to? And in a place where you have to walk 6 hours in either direction to get to one clinic or the other, and if they have electricity, it's the difference between you and your child's life or death on that given day, and you need to find out who has kerosene or petrol in their generator. That SMS becomes a lifeline and a loop to a service that can save you and your child. And all of these systems were built by local entrepreneurs. They weren't built in New York. They were built by young people in countries which are often low liquidity countries, making the greatest changes that I've seen in the world around them. And so we come back to this question of, is connectivity a human right? I think connectivity is a tool. I think connectivity is a vehicle. I would like to say that the human right is access to services that can save your life. The way that I here know that if I have a problem, I can take out my phone and I can call somebody. I can get access to help. I can report a crime. I can find the best restaurant that my friends can't find faster than they can. I like that one. I can find a kitten at any hour, and I can find 10 different pictures of kittens. But the serious services, the services that really can save lives, the services that can lead us to understand how to provide education to our kids in the next 10 years when we know we're not teaching the right things to this generation, that can lead us to understand how we can provide health care to a population where we'll never have enough doctors and nurses in the world to cover the population of those in need. Those pieces of information are not about connectivity alone. They're about something more. And so what I would say is, as we're thinking about the near future, and it's pertinent to us in places where there is a lot of connectivity now, because people are talking about internet sovereignty and net neutrality and who controls the information on the internet. And as we're looking at a world that's increasingly interconnected, I'd like to propose 3 things to you guys. And those 3 things are that whatever type of services are created cannot be owned by any one group. You can't, like water, cannot allow a corporate entity to shut off access to life-saving services. And this can happen if things aren't set up right from the beginning. I'd like to say that all of this stuff has to be nested, has to end up with the ownership of government. It has to be there in a way that the governments of the countries that we work in, that we live in, have a vested interest in the continuance of services. And it has to be done in a way that these services are developed locally. Because the 311 service in New York doesn't work the same way in London and doesn't work the same way in Lusaka. And we have an opportunity now in 2014 to work together as a planet to understand what type of legislation we can push for, what type of entrepreneurs we can support, and what types of networks we can create to have a world that's not only connected, but that's connected to a vital and responsive future. Thank you very much.